Joseph Ebron, prisoner number 08655-007, was transferred for beating up other prisoners while he was at USP Atlanta, Georgia. He's a member of a group of inmates that collectively we call the DC Blacks. In all my 23 years of working at the Supermax USP Marion, I've never met a collection of prisoners more unlikable than the DC Blacks. Even other black people shy away from this group. I have no idea what it is in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, that makes people so disagreeable. The Aryan Brotherhood has killed several members of this group, and several of them have been killed by DC Blacks. All told, I'd say that the ABs are a little more deadlier, but even that gang of homicidal maniacs at least put up a front of basic manners. Not so with the DC Blacks. The prisoners in DC were, their system, it was so poorly run and violated people's rights as a matter of daily operations that they closed all their facilities and the federal government took it over. Oh goody. Now I get to deal with even more assholes. But even this group of reprobates, some stood out as outstanding members of a group that'd be better off if they'd not been born. Ebron is an outstanding example of this type of individual. One fine day in USP Atlanta, he got into a fight. The unusual thing was his screaming at the victim of his assault was that, while he was attacking the man, he was yelling that he was a cooperating government witness. In prison, you do your own time. Some call it staying in your lane, minding your own business. Fretting about the actions of others that don't have an impact on you is just a recipe for personal disaster. As you'll see later in this story, what he was saying would be of interest later at a murder trial that he was the guest of honor at. When in prison, it's best to follow the advice of my buddy who was in the army with me, Daniel Sabori. He said, if you don't talk, people think you're stupid. But as soon as you open your mouth, you erase all doubt. Ebron helped talk himself into the death house with statements like he made while beating that guy. For legal reasons, I won't name or give the details about a trial I attended. It had a DC Black who was off the rails like this Ebron character. The similarities in the two trials is just incredible. If I didn't know any better, I'd have thought that Ebron is the same guy that I met at USP Marion. It had the exact same results as this story. As the prisoner I knew and testified against had not had any justice, final justice meted out to him yet either, I don't wish to give any appeal lawyers any ammunition. Nobody told me to keep quiet. I'm just exercising a little self-restraint in this instance. After the guy's dead, I may tell you his story, but not yet. In the case I was involved in, the prisoner was angry. I beat the hell out of him with a riot baton for attacking another prisoner. I don't recall the exact words he used at this late date. I mean, gosh, this is 20 years later, but he did intimate that he was the one who was going to murder me. He said this in front of my partner that day. Later, my partner and I were called to testify, but only I could recall the incident. The other officer just couldn't recall the one time out of many that somebody wanted to kill me. He told the prosecutor that at Marion there was always somebody wanting to stab me to death, and he couldn't recall every time it happened. The prosecutor was incredulous at this. I told him, it's life at Marion. We usually only remember the times that they actually do try to stab us to death as an unusual enough incident. But by now, 7 years has passed from the incident to the trial, and I can remember every time somebody wanted me dead. I still relive them when I walk the halls in Marion in my dreams. I had to go out of state and testify in the other prisoner's case. I think it's gonna start raining. I got to meet a small group of retired officers who were also there to give evidence. I don't recall these years later who they were, but I did notice that they all had issues with their knees, ankles, and legs. just like now, I have foot issues. One of the risks of walking on hard floors for decades, I guess. I had to leave my little .32 Walther PPK pistol in the car every time I entered the federal courthouse because the U.S. Marshals are the only ones that could be armed inside the federal building. I thought it was a bit of an annoyance. The government gave me a bunch of money to feed and house me during the trial, but I bought all my food at a grocery store and cooked it in my little 2-star or 1-star motel room. People ask me why I would do such a thing. Aren't you afraid, they ask? Look, I work in a Supermax prison where prisoners want to stab me to death if given half a chance. I was in the Army and I lived in a tent for months at a time during the winter in Central Europe. A 1-star hotel compared to that is a luxury vacation. That year, my kids got a nicer Christmas. After I testified, the mother of the victim was walking up and down the hallway wailing about how they killed her boy. She made such a big scene, wouldn't shut up about it. I thought it, probably wouldn't look pretty good for political reasons to tell the grieving mother, to just shut the hell up. So I kept my mouth closed. Barely. After all, her kid was just another prisoner who victimized others. He got killed. So what? He wouldn't be hurting anybody else again. I was not there, but I did get the records of the incident that got this Ebron sentenced to death. I was also at a trial like his, like I said, and I hope my part in that trial helped get that guy on death row where he sits today. This is how Ebron earned his death penalty. On May the 6th, 2005, Keith Barnes, an inmate from Washington, D.C., arrived at the United States Penitentiary in Beaumont, Texas. During his in-processing, he met with a case manager for an intake screening before being assigned to a cell block. During the screening, Barnes told the case manager he had testified against his co-defendants in 2 1998 murder trials that took place in Washington, D.C., and he was concerned about his safety because the other inmates from the D.C. area might have been aware of his cooperation. Notably, one of his co-defendants, James Carpenter. Despite his voiced concern, Barnes was placed in the prison's general population. This might sound familiar to some of you. This is exactly the same scenario that happened to Whitey Bulger, the Boston Mafia guy, who eluded capture for so long. I'd like to talk to you today about Patreon and supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to As the Key Turns on Patreon and support me for as little as $3 a month. There are benefits for supporting me as the various levels. Check it out. You may recall he was murdered in prison by another prisoner who hated snitches. Bulger was put in the general population when he was a known snitch. It's because of stories just like this one that I think Bulger was killed by the incompetence of the BOP staff and not some prearranged assassination by anybody. The same thing also happened in this case and the one I testified at. My point is, incompetence is more to blame for murders like Bulger than carefully laid out conspiracies. They happen all the time. You just never hear about them because we're trained to keep our mouths shut and not talk about it. I'm one of the very few who will ever speak out. Anyway, back to my story. The next day, after his arrival, Barnes was found dead on the top bunk of the bed in his cell. The autopsy revealed that he had died of being stabbed 106 times by a sharp round instrument in an 8-inch by 4-inch area right over his heart. The day after the murder, May the 8th, 2005, prison officials conducted mass interviews of inmates to gather more information regarding Barnes' murder. During these interviews, Charles Sherman, another inmate from the D.C. area, identified Ebron, Marwin Mosley, Michael Bacate as the killers. Today, nobody knows the whole truth, but during a trial, Sherman and Ebron told two completely different stories. In 2005, Sherman was serving a life sentence for armed robberies he committed in the Washington, D.C. area and was being housed in the Delta Bravo unit of USP Beaumont. Generally, in prison, inmates from particular states tend to stick together for protection. When inmates arrive at USP Beaumont, they're approached by the other prisoners and they find out where the guy's from. Once this is known, the newly arrived inmate is pointed in the direction of other prisoners who are from his hood. After Sherman learned of Barnes' arrival, he, Bacati, and Mosley approached Barnes. When they first met Barnes, he gave an Arabic name and not his legal name. After this meeting, Barnes went to his cell, which was also located in Bravo Delta. Sherman, Bacati, and Mosley then had a powwow about Barnes. During this meeting, Mosley told the group that he didn't believe that the Arabic name was the Barnes' real name. If you'd like to read a really interesting book about USP Marion and the prison system in general, then you've got to read a book by Dr. Marla Patterson, the retired chief psychologist at USP Marion. Her book is named As I Live and Breathe, and I bought it on Kindle version from Amazon, and it's also available in hardback from Barnes & Noble. Mosley told him that he thought he recognized the new prisoner and thought his name was Keith Barnes. When Sherman asked Mosley how he knew Barnes, Mosley said he seemed to remember him rolling on some other, quote, good dudes in the DC jail. Mosley and Carpenter was one of those good dudes. They thought the new prisoner might have been Keith Barnes, so Mosley told Sherman and Bacati to find out the new guy's real name. The next day, Bacati tricked Barnes into providing his real name. Bacati told Mosley that the new inmate was Barnes. Now, sure of his suspicion, Mosley told the group to follow him to the rec yard to talk to Tone, the leader of the DC group at USP Beaumont. The purpose of Mosley's visit with Tone was to inform him of his plan to kill Barnes. The three of them went out to the yard during the next rec period. Mosley then told Tone, in which he told Tone that Barnes had testified against his friend, Carpenter. Tone then told him to beat Barnes up and force him to request protective custody. Mosley said that wasn't good enough and that he was going to kill him. Tone said that killing Barnes was unnecessary. All they needed to do was beat him up and force him to request to be, put in protective custody, segregation. Mosley said that he was going to kill Barnes that very night. When Mosley, Sherman, and Bacati left the yard, they went back to the Delta Bravo unit and started planning how to kill Barnes. They decided to kill him in his cell. Bacati would go into Barnes' cell to discuss the Koran. Ebron and Mosley would then enter the cell and kill Barnes. After lunch, Mosley, Sherman, and Bacati set out to look for Ebron and located him on a walkway leading towards Delta Bravo. Mosley and Bacati then told Ebron about Barnes being at Beaumont. Mosley told Ebron about the plan to kill Barnes and asked for his help. Ebron agreed, right then and there to kill him. Bacati told Ebron to wrap a shirt around his head when he entered the Delta Bravo unit to avoid being recorded by the surveillance cameras. And after this, the three of these guys went back to Delta Bravo to continue finalizing their plans on how to kill Barnes. Once dinner was called, Ebron entered Delta Bravo and Bacati went into Barnes' cell. When Sherman saw Ebron in Delta Bravo about dinner time, Ebron had his khaki shirt wrapped about his head. Ebron and Mosley went to Barnes' cell. After Ebron and Mosley entered the cell, Bacati left and situated himself on some stairs that were just outside Barnes' cell. Sherman joined Bacati on these stairs. From these stairs, Sherman was able to look into Barnes' cell. When he looked in, he saw Ebron holding Barnes in a headlock while Mosley's arms were motioning. This was part of the plan to kill Barnes. Ebron was going to hold Barnes while Mosley stabbed him. After a couple of minutes, the door to Barnes' cell opened. Sherman then walked over and closed the door. After he closed the door, Sherman could see Mosley and Ebron lift Barnes up and put him on the top bunk, in the cell. A few minutes after Sherman closed the door, Ebron and Mosley left Barnes' cell and went their separate ways. That was Sherman's story. In 2005, Ebron was serving his sentence for another murder that occurred in Washington, D.C. His story about the Barnes' murder was obviously a concocted pile of crap that blamed Mosley for the whole thing. And nobody was stupid enough to believe such an obvious lie, and Ebron is now waiting for destiny to catch up with him on death row. Before you ask, yes, I think Ebron's guilty and deserves to die for what he did. He was just looking to kill somebody. I was just glad it was a prisoner and not one of us, or me. Same as the guy I testified against, he deserved to be executed for his crimes. Both cases are being appealed, and the lawyers are burning the midnight oil trying to keep these remorseless killers alive. Let's hope that the lawyers fail. If you've liked this video, hit the like button down there, will you? And I promise, it won't kill you to subscribe. Dr. Marla Patterson wrote a book called As I Live and Breathe, and it's about USP Marion. It's probably the finest book on USP Marion, and it's certainly the best one by far that I've ever read. So if you want to really know the nitty-gritty about USP Marion, oh, and by the way, she did meet Silverstein, and she describes the meeting in her book. So if you want to know about a little bit more about him that you ain't going to find anywhere else, Dr. Marla Patterson's book, As I Live and Breathe, is the way to find that out.